In this module, I'll walk you through Lab 1, booting Linux on the AM3517 Zoom kit from a multimedia card. This lab exercise will be more beneficial if you've previously viewed Module 5 of this series, which is the lecture overview of the Linux boot process. If you wish to run this lab exercise yourself, the needed files are available on the training wiki. You'll also need to run the lab setup procedure as shown in Module 2 of this series. Typically when we run this workshop live, we have already imaged the multimedia cards that will be used in the lab exercises. Of course, if you're running these labs at home, you'll need to go through these steps. One of the documents, which is available on the wiki site that I showed you in the previous module, is called AM3517 Lab Setup, and it has the details of all the steps that would be done before a live running of the workshop. So I'll just go ahead and trace through these labs. Obviously we've skipped ahead a little bit in the document. You may want to refer to this document if you run into any problems with these labs. The first thing that we're going to need to do is start up our virtual machine, which has already been done in the lab instructions. So if I just hide this document, you see here Ubuntu X11 folder. This is the VMware image that you also would download off of the wiki. And you can start up either VMware Player first and then select this, but what I typically do is just find the .vmx extension that I'm looking for. If you click on that, Windows will recognize that it needs to use VMware Player in order to open it up. Once you start VMware Workstation in my case, or VMware Player, you'll be presented with this screen. Just power on the virtual machine. It'll take a moment to boot up. First time you run the virtual machine, you'll see that message at the bottom that shared folders have been disabled, so you may want to re-enable those if you're interested, although they're not necessary for the lab exercises. It probably doesn't matter for your running these labs at home whether you choose moved it or copied it, but the safest is always to choose copied it when we start up this VMware image. And then you can just never show this hint again and go through it as we see the VMware booting in the background. I've skipped a little bit of the boot process, no need to watch that, but at some point you will get into this login at the end. You can log in as user, and the password you can just press enter. There is no password. Now you can see that we don't have a desktop environment in this VMware. You'll see why once we get through the lab exercises. We're actually going to export a desktop that's running on the AM3517 platform. But for right now, we're going to just use this Linux machine in order to image our MMC card. So the first thing that you'll need is a MMC SD card reader, USB reader, and just go ahead and plug that in as so. At this point, put the multimedia card into the card reader and plug the card reader into the PC. Now, if you are within the focus of the virtual machine, meaning that anything that you type shows up inside this terminal, then when you add a new USB device, it should actually be automatically captured by the virtual machine as opposed to your host machine. You see here that the following device has been recognized. I'm going to say just never show this again. Even though I had focus, it actually, you can see it's being recognized by my Windows machine. So what we can do there is just go up to VM, Removable Devices, And then here's my the name of my USB MMC card reader. So just go through here and select Connect, Disconnect from Host. Once that's done, you see here that we actually have a message saying inside the VMware that the SD card reader was recognized, and you can even see that it's been mapped to SCSI port SDB. You may have to hit return in order to get back to a prompt. The next step, as you see here, is we want to run sudo sgmap in order to get a listing of all the devices. Now, I'm going to skip that step because, as I mentioned, when we plugged in the card reader, we actually saw in the messages that it fed back that dev SDB is in fact the MMC card reader. But you may want to run that as a double check if you're running at home. And then the next thing that you need to do is execute the buildsd.sh script. So we'll change device or change directory into media. So you see cd /media, and then we'll run the buildsd.sh script. So here I simply change directory. And you can skip the portion where we specify that the device is SDB because that's the default of this shell script. Again, just hit return as your sudo password. Now it's going to run exactly that sgmap command that the instructions previously said, and you can see the feedback at the top here. And once again, there's a double check that dev SDB is in fact the MMC card reader. The reason, by the way, that we're mentioning this 3 times is it is possible to create damage to the virtual machine, or if you were somehow running these lab files off of an actual Linux desktop, it's very easy to create damage with this script, because the first thing it's going to do is format this SCSI device. In some cases, hard disk drives are also, mapped into SCSI devices on a system. But in our case, we are fine to go ahead and press Y. And you can see here that what the script's going to do is it's going to go through and create 2 partitions on this MMC card. The first is a FAT32 boot partition where the U image is going to be placed. The second one is a file system partition where we're going to have a Linux ext3 file system placed in, so that we're actually able to boot the kernel and file system all off of the multimedia card. When the process completes, you'll get back to a prompt as you see here. It can take about 10 minutes to do a complete imaging of the multimedia card using this script. Obviously we used a little bit of time lapse so you wouldn't have to sit through that. Next thing I'm going to do is go back to the lab instructions. I just want to point out this first item in the lab instructions. It's a very important one, very easy one to miss, is we need to make sure that we set the boot pins, the boot mode pins on this development board to boot from the multimedia card. And you can see here on the diagram. And let's just go ahead then and remove the multimedia card from our reader and plug it into the board. Now remove the program multimedia card and place it into the AM3517 Zoom board. You'll be placing it in face down relative to the side that shows the LCD. And then power on the board. At this point we're ready to power on the board. Begin by opening TerraTerm. If we go to Setup, Serial Port, we can verify the settings. Again, COM2 is where the FTD driver is mapped on this Windows machine. You can check that in the Device Manager. And then these settings, baud rate 115K, 8-bit, no parity, 1 stop bit, and no flow control, are the settings we went through in the previous module. Once you have it set up as you like, you can go to Setup and then Save Setup. And then if you just select the teraterm.ini, that'll be the default setup for teraterm every time you start it up. Now I flip the switch, the power switch on the board. And you can see here that first bit of garbage that comes across is normal. Then you see two messages saying that we're booting from the MMC. The first message says that the X loader is booting from the MMC, and then that U-boot is booting from the MMC. This warning, the bad CRC using default environment is normal. That's what we're expecting. And if you want to see what the environment variables are as set, we can print env. You can see there's quite a few of them. We can start with print env bootargs. Print env boot command, boot cmd. You see here that there's some if, then, else statements. Basically what these do is they attempt to boot Linux from the MMC card. If that fails, they'll then boot from the onboard NAND. So we have the MMC set up so that this boot will run. The main command that's going to do that is this MMC boot macro. So we can print env MMC boot. And then you see the main one here is run MMC args. That's going to set our boot arguments. And after the boot arguments are set, then the boot m command just says to boot from memory. This memory variable will be set by the rest of the macro. Now if I finally print env MMC args, you'll see our settings. We set up a console. We say that the root file system is on the multimedia card, the block version of the driver, device 0, partition 2, and that the root file system type is ext3. Also, this root weight is important when booting off of the MMC card. So finally, you can either power cycle the board again and not halt the countdown procedure, or we can just type run boot command. You can see it first is booting the MMC, doing a fat load actually off of the first partition of the MMC. And then you can see the feedback as Linux boots off of the file system that's stored on the second partition of the multimedia card. Finally, we get to the login screen. You can type root with no password, and here we are. We can list the root directory, and here it is, as well as doing other Linux commands.